About Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey, officially the Collegiate Church of St. Peter at Westminster, is an Anglican church in the City of Westminster, London, England. Since 1066, it has been the coronation site for 40 English and British monarchs and the burial place of 18 English, Scottish, and British monarchs. At least 16 royal weddings have taken place there since 1100. Although the origins of the church are unclear, a monastery housing Benedictine monks existed on the site in the mid-10th century. The church received its first major building in the 1040s, commissioned by King Edward the Confessor, who is buried there. Construction of the current church began in 1245 on the orders of Henry III. The monastery was dissolved in 1559, and the church was made a special royal church, a Church of England church, answerable directly to the monarch, by Elizabeth I. The Abbey, the Palace of Westminster, and St. Margaret's Church became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987 for their historical and symbolic significance. The Gothic architecture of the church is largely inspired by 13th century French and English styles, although parts of the church have earlier Romanesque or later Baroque and modern styles. The Henry VII Chapel, at the east end of the church, is a typical example of Perpendicular Gothic architecture. The antiquarian John Leland called it an orbis miraculum, wonder of the world. The abbey is the burial place of over 3,300 people, many of whom are prominent figures in English history: kings, prime ministers, poets, actors, musicians, scientists, military leaders, and the unknown soldier. Because of the fame of the figures buried there, the artist William Morris described the abbey as a national Valhalla. History of Westminster Abbey. Historians agree that there was a monastery dedicated to St. Peter on the site before the 11th century, although its exact origins are somewhat unclear. One legend claims that the monastery was founded by the Saxon king Sigebert of Essex, and another claims that its founder was the fictional 2nd century English king Lucius. One tradition claims that a young fisherman on the Thames had a vision of St. Peter near the site. This seems to have been cited as the origin of the salmon offered by Thames fishermen to the monastery, a custom still carried out annually by the Fishmongers' Company. The origins of the abbey are generally thought to date from around 959, when Dunstan and King Edgar founded a community of Benedictine monks on the site. At that time, the location was an island in the River Thames called Thorney Island. This building has not survived, but archaeologists have found some pottery and foundations from this period on the site of the monastery. Between 1042 and 1052, Edward the Confessor began rebuilding St. Peter's Abbey to provide a royal burial church for himself. The church was built in the Romanesque style and was the first church in England to be built on a cruciform plan. Westminster Abbey continued to be used as a coronation site, but after Edward the Confessor, no king was buried there until Henry III began rebuilding it in the Gothic style. Henry III wanted to build it as a shrine to Edward's veneration, to be on a par with the great churches of France such as Reims Cathedral and Sainte-Chapelle, and as a burial place for himself and his family. More than 3,300 people are buried or commemorated at the monastery. For most of its history, most of the people buried there apart from kings were people with connections to the church, either ordinary locals or monks of the monastery, who were generally buried without any surviving markers. Since the 18th century, it has been an honor for any Englishman to be buried or commemorated in the abbey, a practice encouraged by the lavish funeral and monument of Isaac Newton, who died in 1727. By 1900, so many prominent figures were buried at the monastery that writer William Morris called it the National Valhalla. Politicians buried in the abbey include Pitt the Elder, Charles James Fox, Pitt the Younger, William Wilberforce, William Gladstone, and Clement Attlee. A group of scientists surround the tomb of Isaac Newton, including Charles Darwin and Stephen Hawking. Actors include David Garrick, Henry Irving, and Laurence Olivier. Musicians tend to be buried in the north aisle of the nave, and include Henry Purcell and Ralph Vaughan Williams. George Frederick Handel is buried in Poets' Corner. It is estimated that 18 English, Scottish, and British kings are buried in the abbey, including Edward the Confessor, Henry III, Edward I, Edward III, Richard II, Henry V, Edward V, Henry VII, Edward VI, Mary I, Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth I, James I, Charles II, Mary II, William III, Queen Anne, and George II. Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots were the last monarchs to be buried with full tomb effigy. Monarchs buried after them were commemorated in the abbey with simple inscriptions. George II was the last monarch to be buried at the abbey, in 1760, and George II's brother, Henry Frederick, was the last member of the royal family to be buried at the abbey, in 1790. Most monarchs after George II were buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, or at Frogmore Royal Burial Ground, to the east of Windsor Castle. The south transept of the church is known as Poets' Corner because of the many burials and memorials to poets and writers. The first was Geoffrey Chaucer, buried c. 1400, who worked as clerk of the king's works and had apartments in the abbey. The second poet, Edmund Spenser, who lived in the vicinity of the abbey, was buried nearby in 1599. The idea of Poets' Corner did not take shape until the 18th century, when memorials were erected to writers buried elsewhere, such as William Shakespeare and John Milton. Since then, writers buried in Poets' Corner have included John Dryden, Alfred, Lord Tennyson, Charles Dickens, and Rudyard Kipling. Not all writers buried in the abbey are in the south transept. Ben Jonson is buried standing upright in the north aisle of the nave, and Aphra Behn in the cloister. On the floor, just inside the great west door in the center of the nave, is the tomb of the unknown soldier, an unidentified soldier who died on the battlefields of Europe during the First World War. Although many countries have a tomb of the unknown soldier or soldier, the one at Westminster Abbey is the first. It arose in response to the unprecedented number of war dead. The idea came from Army chaplain David Railton, who suggested it in 1920. The funeral was held on November 11, 1920, the second anniversary of the end of the war. The unknown soldier lay in state for a week afterward, and an estimated 1.25 million people viewed his tomb during that time. The tomb is the only floor stone in the monastery that is forbidden to be stepped on, and every visit by a foreign head of state begins with a visit there. Royal events at Westminster Abbey. The abbey has strong links with royalty. It has been visited by monarchs, hosting coronations, royal weddings, and funerals, and several monarchs have attended services there. One king was born and another died at Westminster Abbey. In 1413, Henry IV collapsed while praying at the shrine of Edward the Confessor. He was moved to the Jerusalem chamber, where he died shortly after. Edward V was born at the abbot's house in 1470. The first Jubilee celebration held at the abbey was for Queen Victoria's golden centenary in 1887. Rather than the full regalia she wore at her coronation, she wore black mourning attire complete with the Order of the Garter's insignia and a miniature crown. He sat in the coronation chair, which had been given a layer of dark varnish for the occasion, which was then carefully removed, making her the only queen to sit in the chair twice. Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, Prince Philip, celebrated their silver, golden, and diamond wedding anniversaries with services at the Abbey and regularly attend annual commemorations there for Commonwealth Day. The monarch participates in the Royal Maundy ceremony on Maundy Thursday each year, where selected elderly people as many of each sex as the monarch's years of life receive alms in the form of coins. The service has been held in churches across the country since 1952, and returns to the monastery every 10 years. Thus is the explanation regarding the history of Westminster Abbey in general. If you are interested in its more detailed history, you can visit Westminster Abbey directly to get the best experience and learn about its more complete history. Note: Westminster Abbey is a historic church that has witnessed the coronation of English kings and queens for over 1,000 years. Located near the Houses of Parliament, the church has magnificent Gothic architecture and houses the tombs of many famous figures, including Charles Darwin and Sir Isaac Newton. It is not only a religious center, but also a center of English culture and history. The uniqueness of Westminster Abbey lies in the beauty of the stained glass windows that adorn its walls, creating a solemn and serene atmosphere. In addition, this church was also the venue for the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton in 2011, adding to its appeal as a site full of historical stories.